Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Simone once again. You're a social studies teacher at Sewanega High School, and today's video is going to be more about the Gilded Age. So let's just get right into it. It was the author Mark Twain who actually used this term, the Gilded Age, to describe the late 1800s in American history. So remember, we've done a lot of review in class. The Civil War is from 1861 to 1865. The time period after the Civil War is called Reconstruction. And then the entire late 1800s is what this author Mark Twain called the Gilded Age, because he described it as there was everything was golden on the outside, gilded, but underneath there was a lot of poverty. So it's referring to the fact that the gap between the rich and the poor was increasing. The rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer. It's his take on the late 1800s. And as we go through all the slides here, you'll then make your own determination as to what you think we should have done about this era in American history. So, this is just an overview of all the key topics of events that happened during the Gilded Age. So, it's a time of industrialization, and we're going to go through these in detail. The railroads were growing tremendously. You have all these new inventors who are creating new products for Americans. The growth of big business. You're going to see the formation of monopolies during this time. The key principle of the government was called laissez-faire, which means hands off in French. They really allowed the businesses to do whatever they wanted. There were very few laws that were regulating business. Workers started to defend themselves and they formed labor unions. You're going to see a lot of people moving to the cities. That's called urbanization. That's where many of the jobs were located. And then in our previous video, we talked about the settlement of the West and how people moved because of the Homestead Act. And then that led to conflict with Native Americans. It also led to a lot of problems economically for farmers, and that's why they started the Populist Party. That we did in our previous video, but everything else we're going to go through today. So just understand that industrialization is a change in the way goods are made. Early in the 1800s, before the Civil War, this is a seventh grade topic. We really industrialized by going from making goods in the home to now making them into factories. But this era of industrialization that people refer to as the Industrial Revolution, this is more about the oil industry, the steel industry, more electric machinery during this time period. The railroads, and we may have done this in the West video as well, but the railroads are a major reason why the United States was able to expand as much as it did. So we had our first transcontinental railroad done in 1869. It was in Promontory Point, Utah. They put the golden spike in the ground. We had four of these railroads by 1900. And this is also one of the reasons why we created our time zones, because the railroads needed to have a little more continuity with their travel. The inventors, remember we did a little activity in class with this. There's so many of them. And then next week, we're going to do a whole lesson on the South, and we're going to talk about African American inventors who didn't get the same recognition as these people. But the two probably most famous ones are Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone and Thomas Edison, who was he was like called the Wizard of Menlo Park in New Jersey. He had a whole host of things that he invented. One of them he gets credit for is the light bulb, but again, we're going to learn that there might be some controversy with that later on. So the whole word monopoly that I want you to understand is when one business controls like 90 or 95% of the industry. And this is what happens during this time period. So because of laissez-faire, the whole concept that businesses should be left alone. It originates. I'm probably getting a little bit too detailed here, but the writer Adam Smith, 1776, he wrote *The Wealth of Nations*. There's this belief that businesses should be able to thrive on their own without any interference from the government, and that is exactly what happened in the 1800s. Now, as we've gone over, there were a lot of workers who were struggling. So there were some people who had this belief in social Darwinism that um, you may have learned about Darwin in science class. I'm not sure yet, but it's the whole concept of the fittest will survive, the strongest will survive. And it's a harsh view, but it's one that some people hold, and it's a debate that we could actually have in class. So these are the men who are the most notorious for the rise of big business during the Gilded Age: Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and JP Morgan. And the big debate here is, do you think that they're just brilliant businessmen, or do you think that they used unethical practices? And the same debate could be had today with the people we talked about the other day, like Jeff Bezos for Amazon and Mark Zuckerberg for Facebook. They have enormous power, enormous wealth. Do you think they're doing great things for our country? People love their products, or do you think that they're more unethical in their treatment? And if you believe that they need to be, let's say, reined in a little bit, then you would support more laws being regulated. If you believe that they're doing great things for the country, then you think that there should be fewer laws. And that's what happened during the Gilded Age. So we did a little reading about this in class, but Carnegie was primarily in the steel industry, made an absolute fortune. Self-made man. He came over here, I believe from Scotland. He worked as like he was like a delivery boy, uh, delivering like telegrams and stuff. And I remember learning he like memorized all the streets, so he was like the most efficient delivery boy. And then he got a job in the railroads. And the big thing about Carnegie is he always saved his money, always kept his wealth, and kept accumulating more and more money, and didn't waste it. And he eventually became like the superintendent of the railroad industry, one of the railroad lines, and just started using this new process for making steel. It was called the Bessemer process, and he just, from making like $1.20 a week as a teenager, became one of the wealthiest men in the world. And something you should know about Carnegie and Rockefeller. I'll go through Rockefeller quickly. Also, he's the oil industry, and he was able to get control of all the different aspects of the oil industry. So he controlled the drilling of the oil out of the ground. Then he refined the oil. He had a hand in that industry, and then he sold the oil. He shipped the oil. He had control of all three aspects. And what he would do is he convinced the railroads to give him a discount. That's called a rebate. And once they got the discount, he could then sell oil to his competitors for a lower price. So he would say to somebody who owned oil, say, listen, I want to buy you out. And the guy would say, I don't want to sell my industry. I don't want to sell my business. He says, okay, well, I'm going to go to the people you're selling oil to, and I'm going to sell my oil to them for cheaper. And it was not illegal. It was totally within the law. And he was another one that became a monopolist. But what you should know about Carnegie and Rockefeller, they both donated tremendous money to charity. Carnegie didn't like the word charity. There's a word you should know. It's called philanthropy. So they built schools, hospitals, parks, museums, libraries. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars at that time, in that time's money. Unbelievable donations throughout their lifetime. So that's why the debate is a tough one for a lot of people to engage in. And remember, there was no income tax at that time. So they weren't even paying any income tax to the federal government. And then Vanderbilt was more involved in the railroad industry, and JP Morgan actually bought Carnegie's U.S. Steel Corporation. So hopefully that gives you, I know you guys did the nice reading in class, but gives you a little insight into those four men. And I threw this out for you. There were some attempts to regulate industry, even though I told you this is a laissez-faire time period. They did create the Interstate Commerce Act. They tried to regulate the railroads. They did try to break up monopolies with the Sherman Antitrust Act. Trust is just another word for a monopoly. Not exactly, but a trust is just like a large corporation. But neither of them were very successful at all, actually. Okay. Um, all throughout this time, people are going to be flocking to the cities, and we're going to do all next week. We're going to talk about immigration to the country, so we'll save that. I won't do that in the video right now, but this is a time where A lot more people are continuing to come from other countries that were not the ones that were here earlier. It'll be more like Southern and Eastern Europe. Just be aware that this whole era of industrialization, I kind of did this already, but the new technologies and laissez-faire policies, this is what's happening during the Gilded Age. And we had a tremendous amount of raw materials that allowed us to industrialize to the way we did. So now the last segment really is, but what about the workers? Workers were suffering from low wages. They had bad, unsafe, unsanitary factory conditions. They were working very, very long hours. They had no protection. So eventually, they're going to form unions. So I wouldn't stress about all the names here. I just wanted you to be aware that there's going to be a variety of unions that are formed during this time period. Probably the most well known at that time period were the Knights of Labor. The American Federation of Labor we actually still have today. But as long as you know that there are labor unions being formed that protect the rights of workers. So you join a union, and today, most unions are of people with the same job. It wasn't like that early on, which made it a little bit more difficult for them to fight for what they were striving for. And then there are going to be some strikes during this time period. So, first of all, the Haymarket Riot, that's not a strike. That was just a protest. And in the Haymarket Riot, they were just simply protesting for better wages and shorter hours. But somebody threw a grenade, somebody threw a bomb, and cops were killed in the ensuing chaos. So they never really found out who did this, but it became associated with the Knights of Labor, so it led to a decline in their um, in their union. The Homestead strike was actually Carnegie's company, and he was very distraught by this, very upset, because he wasn't even here. He was out of the country at the time. But when his workers went on strike, they brought in replacement workers. They also brought in security guards, and it became a violent struggle that did not make Carnegie look good. But the one I'd love for you to remember is the Pullman strike. And the Pullman strike is as follows. We had a bad economic time. So when the economy is bad, usually, people might have to have their wages cut. But the owner of this railroad company, George Pullman, he was so successful that he had his railroad industry, but he also had a town that he built for his workers to live in, but they had to pay him rent. His problem was he lowered their wages, but he kept their rent the same, which shouldn't happen in a bad economic time. So the head of the union, his name is Eugene V. Debs. I'm going to reference him later on in the year. Eugene V. Debs organized this massive strike. They shut down 60% of the trains who were delivering things in America. Massive strike. But the government stepped in under President Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland's the only president to ever be president one time, then lost, and then president again. He's number 22 and number 24. Grover Cleveland said, "You must go back to work." He got a court order. He demanded that they go back to work. Why? Because he argued that they were interfering with the transit of the mail. And any of you that know anything about the post office, it's a federal agency, which means any tampering with the mail is a felony. So the Pullman strike shows that at this time during the Gilded Age, the government was on the side of big business, not on the side of the worker. But in the next unit, which is called the Progressive Era, you're going to see a total change in the philosophy. So that's my presentation, and I hope you were able to pay attention. I'll put a little question up on Google Classroom, but I really hope you continue to watch these extra credit videos because it'll give you an outstanding foundation for when you get to 11th grade and you'll learn American history all over again, but on a much higher level. Take care, everyone, and I will see you in class.